If Quentin Tarantino's Star Trek movie happened 4 years earlier, the franchise would look very different right now. When Quentin Tarantino first revealed that he was developing a Star Trek movie, the internet exploded with curiosity, excitement, and confusion. A filmmaker known for Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill, and Inglourious Basterds, the king of cinematic violence and razor-sharp dialogue, taking on Gene Roddenberry's utopian sci-fi universe? It sounded like the wildest crossover in Hollywood history. But what if Tarantino's Star Trek had actually happened, and not been abandoned in the long, frustrating development cycle that followed? More specifically, what if it had come together 4 years earlier, before Paramount decided to pivot towards streaming projects, and before Star Trek, Discovery, Picard, and Strange New Worlds redefined the modern Trek canon? The ripple effect would have been enormous. Not only would Tarantino's take have changed how audiences saw Star Trek on the big screen, it might have completely rewritten the direction of the franchise as a whole. Tarantino's Star Trek. The wild concept that could have been canon. Tarantino's Star Trek was not going to be your typical phaser blasting, prime directive quoting adventure. According to multiple reports, including interviews with screenwriter Mark L. Smith, The Revenant, Tarantino's film would have been set in the Kelvin timeline, the alternate universe created by J.J. Abrams' 2009 reboot, but with a distinctly 1960s vibe. The story reportedly drew inspiration from A Piece of the Action, a classic Star Trek, the original series episode in which Kirk and Spock visit a planet modeled after 1920s gangster culture. Tarantino's idea was to expand that premise into a full feature film, an R-rated, violent, dialogue-driven space noir dripping with his trademark pulp style. It was bold, risky, and utterly unlike anything Star Trek had done before. And that was precisely the point. But when Tarantino began developing the film in earnest around 2017 to 2018, the timing was already working against him. Paramount was restructuring its film division, and Alex Kurtzman was in the process of reinventing Star Trek for television with Discovery and Picard. The franchise was shifting from cinematic spectacle to serialized streaming storytelling. If Tarantino had come on board 4 years earlier, though, around 2013 or 2014, the entire Trek timeline could have branched off into a radically different direction. 2014. The perfect window that never opened. In 2014, Star Trek Into Darkness had just finished its theatrical run. It made solid box office money, but left fans divided. Critics complained about the film's darker tone, the awkward wrath of Khan references, and the lack of bold storytelling. The franchise's momentum was starting to stall. Paramount wanted another Star Trek movie to reinvigorate interest, but J.J. Abrams had already jumped ship to direct Star Wars: The Force Awakens. The studio was searching for a creative spark, something that could make Star Trek feel dangerous, unpredictable, and cool again. That was the exact moment Tarantino's Star Trek could have exploded onto the scene. Imagine this. Instead of Star Trek Beyond released in 2016, audiences get Quentin Tarantino's Star Trek, a bold R-rated entry that blends vintage Trek optimism with the grit of Reservoir Dogs and the dark humor of Pulp Fiction. Chris Pine's Captain Kirk, Carl Urban's McCoy, and Zachary Quinto's Spock would have stepped into a world of retro-futuristic corruption, gangsters in fedoras wielding phasers, and philosophical showdowns ridden with Tarantino's biting dialogue. It wouldn't have been a standard Trek film. It would have been a pop culture event, a must-see cinematic experiment that pulled new fans into the franchise while reigniting old ones. The tone shift. Star Trek embraces its cool side. Tarantino's style is instantly recognizable, long conversations that simmer with tension, non-linear storytelling, and bursts of violence that punctuate moral ambiguity. Bringing that energy into Star Trek would have changed how the series approached its tone forever. Up until that point, Star Trek movies often leaned into spectacle and idealism, occasionally dipping into darker territory, The Undiscovered Country, First Contact. But Tarantino's vision would have made Star Trek unapologetically edgy without sacrificing intelligence. It's easy to imagine Pine's Kirk delivering a monologue about moral relativism in a smoky alien bar, or Spock engaging in a calm yet unsettling philosophical debate with a mob boss from another galaxy. It would have felt like Trek Noir, a genre mashup that redefined what Star Trek could be. That tonal evolution might have influenced the television side too. Instead of Discovery launching as a grim, more focused prequel in 2017, Paramount might have leaned into Tarantino's cinematic success by greenlighting grittier, character-driven spin-offs, more adult, more introspective, and less reliant on visual spectacle. The cast and crew ripple effect. A Tarantino Star Trek in 2014 would likely have changed who stayed and who left the franchise. Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto's contracts were set to expire around that time. If Tarantino's film had moved forward, both actors almost certainly would have signed on for one last ride under his direction. His star power could have united the Kelvin cast for a high-profile farewell film that doubled as a cultural event. Meanwhile, Simon Pegg Scotty might never have co-written Star Trek Beyond in 2016, and Justin Lin might not have stepped into the director's chair at all. Tarantino's name alone would have been the marketing centerpiece. Behind the scenes, his creative influence could have inspired Paramount to recruit more auteur filmmakers for future Trek projects, people like Denis Villeneuve or Rian Johnson, each offering their own distinctive take. Instead of trying to imitate J.J. Abrams' glossy action style, Star Trek movies could have embraced filmmaker-driven visions. The streaming era might have looked completely different, perhaps the biggest ripple effect of all. If Tarantino's Star Trek had released in 2014 or 2015, the streaming era of Trek would likely have evolved in a totally different way. In our timeline, Star Trek pivoted to TV around 2017 because the film side was stagnating. Discovery, Picard, Lower Decks, Prodigy, and Strange New Worlds were born out of that need to keep the franchise alive on Paramount+. But if Tarantino's film had become a massive critical and financial hit, Paramount might have doubled down on cinematic Trek instead. Star Trek IV, the long-delayed follow-up to Beyond, could have gone into production sooner, with Tarantino's tone influencing the script. The franchise might have balanced both movie and streaming projects more evenly, the way Star Wars now does with its Disney Plus lineup. Even the tone of Picard and Discovery could have shifted. Instead of leaning heavily into serialized trauma and nostalgia, they might have taken cues from Tarantino's emphasis on character introspection, moral grayness, and stylized storytelling. The franchise might have evolved into something far more cinematic across the board. Star Trek's public image would have been transformed. Let's face it, Star Trek has always been respected, but not always considered cool. Tarantino's film could have changed that perception overnight. His involvement would have brought Star Trek to audiences who had never watched a single episode. Cinephiles, Tarantino loyalists, and younger viewers curious about his take on sci-fi would have flooded theaters. Suddenly, Star Trek wouldn't just be a legacy franchise, it would be the talk of pop culture again. Imagine the red carpet premiere, the viral soundtrack curated by Tarantino, maybe with a mix of vintage 1960s pop and eerie space jazz, and the debates over whether he ruined or revived Trek. Even the controversy would have kept the franchise in the spotlight for years.